Loud. And that will typically record the video of the person who's speaking at any given time. So just keep that in mind. So feel free to leave your video on. If you're self-conscious about that, feel free to just mute your microphone and leave your video on. And of course, I do encourage you to make active use of the chat, because it is there for us to have conversations. And really, this whole event is going to be structured as a chat, as a conversation. I have a couple of questions I've prepared in advance just to get the ball rolling, but then after that, we're going to really open it up to everyone. And so another thing you can do is post your questions or comments in the chat, and I'll try to monitor that, for when we get to discussion time. But maybe it's okay to start things out now, I guess, since we've got things recording. Well, welcome to this gathering. My name is Mark Marino. I teach writing at the University of Southern California, where I also direct the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab. And we're the sponsors of a monthly ELIT, or electronic literature reading group, that has some stalwarts. I think we're all of 5 people. I think just about everybody is a graduate student who's in there. Let's see, raise your hand or say a hi if you're one of the regulars. So we've got Leah, we've got Sarah, we've got Zach, and I don't know if any of our other regulars were able to make it today. So it's a small but fiercely curious band of folks who are working in literary scholarship, but also media scholarship, and then also some digital scholarship and making as well. And then we try once a month during these gatherings. Sometimes we have guest speakers. Sometimes we'll pick some realm that we want to look into. So it'll be maybe virtual reality, or I don't know, interactive fiction or installation art. And sometimes the folks who are part of the group will present too, because they've got their own practices and interests as well. And I just want to throw out there, of course, obviously you guys are welcome to come back and join us again next month, because on the 19th of March, we'll be having continuing our book series with Noah Wardrop-Furin's How Pac-Man Eats. This is also a new book. Noah Wardrop-Furin teaches game design at UC Santa Cruz. He's one of the founders of the Software Studies series at MIT Press. And he is also, I don't know, really one of the founders of game studies from my point of view. I don't know if that's a fair way to, he may feel that's overstating the case, but I don't think so in any way. And then the following month in April, we're having an event, and I'll put a link to all these events in the chat. But we're having Jeremy Douglas from UC Santa Barbara will be coming to join us to talk about these wondrous new projects he's been working on to create some machine reading tools for looking at everything from interactive books or game books to comics to TV shows on out. So that'll be exciting as well. And I'd be remiss not to mention a few other things. One of them is on February 26th, that group of people that I just mentioned to you, well, I haven't mentioned Jessica Pressman just yet, but Jessica Pressman, Noah Wardrop-Furin, Jeremy Douglas, myself, and a handful of grad students, including Sarah Siston, who's here, are going to speak with us about academic writing groups, because for those first 4 people I mentioned, we were part of a dissertation writing group back in the day. And, I won't say how many years ago it's been, but it's been quite some time. And so now we just thought we would reconvene and talk about this notion of scholarly writing, academic writing groups, and what function they can play in our lives as we're developing projects, book projects. Like, in fact, I think one of the reasons it came to mind was the book project that Jessica's working on, the book project, my book that just came out, Noah's book, Jeremy's projects. Like, these are all things that we've workshopped together. And of course, we rely heavily on those communities, because even though one person tends to get credit for a monograph, we know from the acknowledgements page that we're indebted to all of the people we're in conversation with as we develop these ideas. Um, one last little plug before I move on, and that's well, two last little plugs. One is that currently we do have the anti-racist critical code studies reading group happening. If you have an interest in that, I can get you some more information. And then also, I should tell you that you have until February 28th to submit to any of the 3 electronic literature organization prizes. There are 3 $1,000 prizes that are awarded in the areas of creative work, scholarship, or lifetime achievement. And you can nominate yourself or one of your works, or you can nominate somebody else's. And again, the deadline for that is February 28th. When I get a chance, I will put a link to the submission page also in the chat. So let me think. Is that all the announcements? That seems like that was like an inordinate number of announcements, but I think that is just about it. Do you guys have anyone have any questions about any of those they want to throw in the chat or say out loud before we formally begin our conversation with Dr. Pressman?
Mark, my mom wants to know why there's a Yoda on screen.
Oh no, there's still, okay. All right. Well, baby Yoda has been, I've been taking care of him for the time being, but I probably should, I'm going to put him to sleep for now. So just for the time being. So he's not a complete distraction, but
okay.
Yes, he's, I think that this COVID moment, if this interested at all, Mr. Pressman, this COVID moment has sometimes required us to cross the lines of caring for our families and our little ones at the same time that we're taking care of our professional responsibilities. So maybe we could think of Baby Yoda's presence as a little homage to that.
Love it.
Yeah, I don't know. Or maybe I just really like filters, which is also quite true and quite possible. Okay. All right. So without further ado, hold on. I need to change my hats for 1 second. Not literally, but figuratively. Okay. So let me introduce our next speaker, both with her formal biography, but also with some informal biography. So Jessica Pressman is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at San Diego State University, where she is the co-founder of San Diego State's Digital Humanities Initiative. She's and I think you're also co-director of that once again. Is that true?
I am. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So make sure current responsibilities are getting their props. In addition to writing Bookishness, Loving Books in a Digital Age, she is also the author of Digital Modernism, Making It New in New Media. She's the co-author of Reading Project, a collaborative analysis of William Poundstone's Project for Tachyscope, which she co-wrote with Jeremy Douglas and myself. And you can find more of her works at jessicapressman.com. Of course, that doesn't even begin to talk about who Jessica Pressman is. And I guess for the sake of the usuals, the usual suspects of our ELIT reading group, maybe in an informal level, I can say that Jessica Pressman is really one of my closest collaborators, colleagues, and certainly friends for very many years. I first got to meet Jessica in 2002 in a seminar at UCLA that was being co-taught by Bill Seaman and Catherine Hales. And I remember Kate Hales saying, there's someone you have to meet. When I first met Kate Hales, there's someone you have to meet. And that someone was Jessica Pressman, who then was coordinating acting in a coordinator position. I don't know what your official title was, but for the Electronic Literature Organization, and became one of those people who really just astounded me. First, in her ability to her critical insights into things, right? Then in the nature of her scholarship, she's perhaps one one of the most attentive and polished scholars of anybody I know in the field. And then in her uncanny ability to build community. And so the Electronic Literature Organization, I think, is in really owes her a debt of gratitude. But also, again, you can just see from even in the comparatively few years since she's been at San Diego State, she's really worked to help build this network, this community of scholars working in the areas of digital humanities. And then, of course, we all get to benefit from those communities that she builds. So having known her so long in this context as one of the top scholars in the field of digital literature, it's sort of amusing to me, or curious to me, that the book she writes next is Bookishness, a book about book culture, a book about these paper things that I thought we had left behind because, you know, we're people of the future, but this is a love letter to books. You know, this is someone who deeply cares about not only the past of books, but the present and future of books, and someone who by no means sees any part of this medium as a, you know, remember when it was popular to say the print is dead? Do you remember that moment? That was like everybody's favorite slogan for a little while there. But print is alive, definitely, on the pages of this book and the projects that it writes about and the way in which she treats it. So I guess, Jessica, if I could start our discussion with a question, could I ask you, how does a scholar who's devoted so much of her time to the study of digital literature find her way writing a work about bookishness, book culture, and print?
I love that. Thanks, Mark, for the intro. And before I answer the question, I just want to say that that Mark has been part of this book since its beginning. He's been part of all my books since their beginning. He was my dissertation writing group member, but he's read every word of this book more than anyone. And some of the ideas are probably his. And I'm so grateful to him. He's like clearly named in the acknowledgements, but I want to say that out loud. And also to all of you, because it's really, you know, you write a book. I spent 10 years writing this book, and you put it out there, especially in 2020, in an age when you can't do book celebrations and you can't go to the bar and raise a toast, and you can't go to the conference and hawk your books. So it's really lovely that you all showed up and are from all over the world. It means so much to me to know that the book is actually physically in Wales, and other places. So I'm really honored to talk about it. And I'm especially honored to talk about it in a conversation. I'd really love to hear your questions. Some of you have heard me talk about this book before for a long time, at Portugal. I see Anna right there. In Portugal a few years ago at the ELO conference, I spoke about Icebound Compendium in relation to the book. So I'm here for the questions and the conversation. And it's a really easy answer, Mark, in terms of, you know, returning to books, going from, you know, I love books. We dedicate our lives to books, right? And then going to eLit and coming back to books because, you know, I actually am interested in the bodies of literature. I'm interested in the materiality of literature. I'm interested in bodies in general, but, you know, in the humanities, we talk about bodies and embodiment a lot, often without talking about real bodies or, you know, the feelings and actualities of real bodies, which I hope we can talk about later, but how COVID has made us really aware of our real bodies and real bodies and real spaces and kind of the feelings and pressures and the beauty of being surrounded by those bodies of books in this time. So I'm less interested. I've always been trying to dissolve the binary of print and digital. I've never believed that this will kill that the computer would kill the book. And I've never, and Kate Hales brought this to my attention in that seminar, Mark, like way back then, that it's too easy to say book versus computer or print versus digital, that you really have to ask what is distinct and what's the relationships. And she taught us to focus on bodies and materialities. And so I actually see it being very fluid. And it's not a surprise to me that books are alive and well in a digital age and that digital culture is obsessed with books. And my book, I read electronic literature in this print book. I explore it a lot, but I actually don't segregate it into sections or chapters on e-lit. So I see it as literature, and I see it as literary culture. And frankly, I see it as culture today. And I think that's actually, it's good for us as those interested in stories and narratives and the human experience to not be focused so much on those media categories in ways that hold us back. So I hope that the book can bring conversations between different kinds of scholars. And I'm very happy. I've mostly spoken to book history scholars and literature scholars. So it's wonderful to be talking to media scholars today as well.
All right. Well, that leads me to a follow-up. So one thing that's funny about this book is that your concept of bookishness has been cited by people long predating the publication of this book. And it's almost as though as soon as they heard the idea, people ran with it. Like it's something that sort of made sense to people, and they wanted to make something of it and go somewhere with it. And so one question I have for you, is as long as your parents are here, a lot of times we have to explain our scholarly projects to our parents. It might be a holiday gathering or just a regular Sunday visit or Saturday visit, Friday night visit, perhaps. In any case, what's one thing about the concept of bookishness that you find that people kind of don't quite get right away, or they sort of like they misunderstand what you mean by bookishness, and so you spend the first X amount of time having to kind of resituate things?
That's so great. I just want to point out on that caveat, Mom and Dad, that there are people that actually read the first book, Digital Modernism. John over in my right-hand corner, who's in Wales, he said he read the first book, because just so you know, any scholar in here knows their parents, buy or download the book and then don't actually read it. Hopefully this book was more accessible. In terms of bookishness, it's interesting, Mark, that you asked the question about what people misunderstand. I think it's the tone. Some people either, and partly that's my fault as a writer or a speaker, I wrote this book as a series of talks given around the world. Some of you have been in those great places when we could travel. And some people thought, is bookishness bad? Is it good? Is it celebrating, the death of books, or is it, what's the tone? What's the kind of stance? And I think that was the biggest misunderstanding, because I don't mean it as good or bad. Again, one of those binaries. I actually think it just is. And I think that's why you see it everywhere, because once you start to identify it as a concept, and as I call it, a kind of aesthetic from the beginning, you can start to identify it. And then I think there's something reflective about it, because I think it says more about us if we see it as good or bad than it does about the cultural situation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was something that was always really interesting to me, is that people wanted to see it as either positive or negative, and not something that could be both, or could be on a sliding scale, kind of like literature itself.
They wanted you to pass judgment. Like maybe they saw that word that I saw in your book, the word kitsch, and they thought, oh, kitsch, like that sounds critical. So that sounds like a pejorative somehow. But it seems like maybe you don't categorize it necessarily as something negative.
Plus, I love kitsch. I mean, one of the reasons for writing this book, I think Liz was with me at the Brown conference years ago, when I bought a painting of a stack of books by a student from Brown, and that was like my first research purchase for the book. Right, it was the ability to buy all this kitschy stuff. And since then, your colleague, Mark, Daniel Tiffany at USC, wrote a brilliant book about kitsch as being an important literary element in 18th century literature. That it's not actually, he traces it, scholarship usually traces it to the modern period and mass production, industrialization, and popular culture, but Tiffany traces it much earlier to poetry and the colloquial. Yeah, and CN Nye, Caleb, for sure. Like these kinds of, it's good to see you, Caleb. The kind of reconfiguration and historicization of the minor and marginal categories and values of aesthetics. And also thinking like, why is kitsch bad? Is it associated with the lowbrow, with the female, with the with a lower class, et cetera. So those kinds of values. So, so you're right. I spent months researching kitsch, and a lot of that didn't actually make it into the book, but that would be that's a great point for thinking about the values and the domestic, Liz, for sure.
Well, one of the things I want to throw out, yeah. So, and again, this calls to mind, like when you're writing about, tights that have Jane Austen on them, or that, these, or even things that we may not think much of, our iPhone covers and things like that, that look like books, but that show our affection for them. Now, in the Zoom age, we're all Zooming here. Some of us have artificial backgrounds. Adrian, I don't want to call you out. You do have a very nice bookshelf behind you that may or may not be behind you. And then maybe, I don't know, Anna, I'm not sure if you've arranged those books ahead of time or not. There are some nice books in your background, but we see a lot of bookcases in the Zoom age, for sure. And you've thought about this a little bit. Do you want to talk about the place of the bookshelf, the
I've thought
background
about it a
bookshelf?
lot. I'm going to type in, because I just wrote a little piece. It's a short piece. It's like 1,000 words for for the LA Review of Books, which is, it comes from this book. But I did see, a Trump representative with her fake bookshelf set Twitter afire because she had like a crease in the fake bookshelf. And it was just so fascinating. One, it was completely bookishness, but then the fact that people were so interested in how she, was spewing fake news, but using the fake books behind her as some kind of credibility. So, so yeah. And by the way, Adrian, who is one of the pioneering students for digital humanities at San Diego State, I just want to say that. I'm so glad to see him here. But yeah, bookshelves are fascinating. And part of my book is trying to trace, I see it as kind of trying to trace the larger infrastructures for literary studies. We tend to think, maybe not we media scholars, but my colleagues who are mostly literature scholars tend to think of literature as words and content rather than materiality and networks of material matters and infrastructures. So bookshelves are essential to literature and literary studies, always have been. And so they deserved, real bookshelves and fake bookshelves deserve to be part of the study of the literary, and especially when you are using fake bookshelves on your Kindle and your iPhone app all the time, and that those books are now facing forward rather than spine, right? So these kinds of visual elements, these kinds of skewed skeuomorphs are part of the history of books and part of the history of literature, but often get forgotten by literary scholars. So I'm really interested in thinking about the larger infrastructures, the larger material cultures that support literally the study of literature. And that includes the book, right? I mean, I still have lots of students and colleagues that don't want to talk about books as technology, just want to talk about content and stories. So I'm trying to blur the lessons or blend the lessons from media studies and literary studies in that way.
I remember this conversation you were having where, again, I can't remember if you were citing somebody or not, where you were talking about all the ways people use books, right? So we might use books as decorations, right? We might use them as our bona fides, to impress other people. Again, thinking back to Gatsby, or again, you raised the example of a person, in this case, a young woman on the subway or on the bus, who may use a book as a mechanism for not having to talk to someone who they don't want to talk to.
Yeah.
And again, just thinking about, again, like to me, that just opens up this aspect of even literary studies, because again, even being a digital scholar myself, I probably think about books as primarily holders of content. And then thinking about now, oh no, there are these objects in space that we use socially in all sorts of ways. Again, changes things dramatically.
Yeah, well, the field of the history of the book or studies in the book has a lot of great stuff. One of my favorite, just because I like saying his name, Wolfgang Schwivelbusch. I don't know if anyone's, right? Wrote a pioneering book about books and trains, about the importance of the invention of the train for books and literature. It is remains the best book hands down, plus the best name to ever say. But that story, Mark, of the importance, the emergence of paperbacks, the emergence of affordable literature in the 19th century coincide with the emergence of the train and the need to both not get sick from traveling for the new travelers on the train, but also to carve out private space with a book or a newspaper. So, you know, books do a lot of things, always have, they are things. And I think that's of interest to me as well, is the thingliness. You know, we have platform studies now in the field of electronic literature. We have software studies. Well, you know, we have book studies too, but oftentimes those fields don't meet. So where are the interesting points where the scholars who know how to really study material culture, and we have, you know, Matt Kirschenbaum, for example, who blends both. Liz does too. I'm so glad to see you, Liz. Right, but those are really exciting points of intersection that we could do a lot more of on both ends, literature and media studies.
Excellent. All right, now I don't want to monopolize this conversation. Let me open it up. I see a question in the chat from John Morgan, and I wonder, John, do you want to say your question aloud? That would archive it with your voice. That would be nice.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah, in Bookishness, I noticed chapters immediately that address Rorschach texts by Stephen Hall, Tree of Codes, Jonathan Safran for House of Leaves, Mark Danielewski. They're all on my bookshelf. It's just that I've got the curtains behind me, so I can't position them or anything else. So yeah, I love these books. And immediately as I saw those you were reviewing those, I thought, I've got to have this because I'm writing about these myself to some extent in my own work. But what do you think, therefore, then, that these are not books as archives of ideas? They're kind of semiotic art forms in themselves. They're creating a scene of the referent. The thing that they're actually representing is somehow tangibly or materially created and brought in. So it's not just writing about something, it's writing with something, so to speak.
That's beautiful. And exactly right. I mean, those were the books. Those House of Leaves is always the book that starts everything for me. But the Rorschach text was really the book that's the novel and the book, because it's not just the novel, right? You're right. It is the book that matters in that case that started this book. And thinking about those two together was really the origin point. The first talk I ever gave on bookishness in the first period, the first piece I ever published was on the Rorschach texts. And that was when I was still thinking about this book as being about experimental literature and avant-garde literature and print, you know, how digital practices are enabling wonderful print publishing that's affordable in ways that only artist books could do it before, or certain kinds of textbooks. So you're absolutely right. Those are the novels that not only tell the story, but do it visibly on their page and make the page an interface, as Bonnie Mack writes about, illuminating the page as an interface for interaction in really very beautiful ways.
And could it possibly be said that there can also be a kind of almost a tour guide to the places that they're talking about? Because Waterstone's Deansgate, Manchester used to be a local bookshop for me. And I recognise the stairs where they had the tunnel into the basement. And years later, when I saw that, because I was there in the 80s and 90s, and I actually went back to Waterstones to look for the shelf where they got into the basement. Sadly, they'd moved all the fiction upstairs.
That's so cool. That's like me going all the way to Buenos Aires to go seek out Borges' library. Which,
yeah, fabulous.
Yeah, no, it's I love that scene so much about going into the underground. I think of it as Auger's underground. That is a bookstore and it is a cathedral. So that really was the book that got me thinking about this, and then moving to kitsch and popular culture and children's literature and chick lit and all that stuff came afterwards. I am kind of situated in the institution as a scholar of experimental literature. So that's where I feel most comfortable, is with those formal, focusing on the formal. And so that's where it's starting to kind of spill out.
Yeah, don't forget our bookshop in Porto too, that showed up in as an inspiration in Harry Potter. Okay, our next we have a question from Caleb. And Caleb, do you want to say your question out loud, or do you want me to read it?
I'm fine. Yeah. I was just curious, like I finally made myself get into audiobooks because I don't read enough. I feel like I'm still recovering from my PhD. And I was wondering if you address audiobooks at all in Bookishness, because I just finished one today, and I was thinking about how audiobooks have really been challenging my interest, really inspired by you, in materiality and literature. Like, how do audiobooks sort of affect our idea that like literature is more than just words and content? Because I just finished The Death of Vivek Oji, which was really, really good. And what I really liked about it was that the people reading it, like, they just it was very performative. They imbued so much emotion into it, that I don't know if I would have read that into it. And so I was just curious if you had any thoughts on like where we fit audiobooks in the conversation of materiality in literature.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Matt Rubery wrote a really fantastic book on the history of audiobooks. He's a book history scholar, and so he thinks about audiobooks as a kind of material form and format. And it's really a helpful book. And one of the things I liked from that book, from his book and his perspective, is he does a nice focus on, because sometimes people will either say, are audiobooks real? Are they books or are they not books? Are they literature? Or are they not literature? And he just, as you can imagine, I'm not interested in those binaries necessarily. And so he kind of rejects that, and instead is focusing on the materiality, which is both the voice, as you're saying, the performance of it, but also the reception. So that audiobooks were first created for those hard of hearing, for people, and sorry, for the blind. So that doesn't make sense. For the blind, but also for soldiers. They were presented as for those people that didn't have either the ability to visually read, or for the people that didn't have time to read. And so there's kinds of historical context for thinking about audiobooks as well, which I think is when you think about audiobook outside of, is it a book, does it count or not, but actually what does it do and what does it satisfy? As you're saying, like, you have different desires for a literary experience in this time of COVID and information overload, then you can think about how, what literature actually does. It's not just visual, it's not just story. It is, as John is saying, also the pleasure and beauty of ink on the page, and of spines, and of many other things. So I think it's a really great question, Caleb. I don't write about it. I didn't answer your question. I don't really address it in the book, but Matt Rubery does.
Thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Anna. Anna, would you like to say your question?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for the book. Actually, I didn't read it all yet. It's how I have this version.
That's great.
So, but I started reading, and I was so much looking forward to it, because actually over the years since we met, actually I started looking at books through the perspective actually you provided. So it's like I'm discovering how complex this object is, and how rich and vibrant this thing we call book is. But my question concerns something I think else. I was just wondering if bookishness is one phenomenon, or are there many? Are you discussing codexness rather than bookishness? Because one of my favorite examples ever is this one of the oldest Buddhist manuscripts book, actually, which was written on a birch bark and discovered recently in Central Asia. So yeah, that's where my question comes from. And also, is this bookishness phenomenon changing over the course of time? Because do you see the difference between bookishness by Dieter Roth, for example, and William Blake on the other hand? Just a couple of examples that came to mind.
No, that's fantastic. What I wouldn't give to have a meal with you in Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think I think that the way that I wanted to present bookishness, and hopefully did, as kind of an encompassing category, and an umbrella. I loved what it sounds like it did what it was supposed to do, is to prompt you to just see differently. So I wouldn't want to say that it's either, one thing or many things, but I do think that, in answer to your question about like Blake, for example, I do think that the bookishness I'm trying to trace out is a contemporary phenomenon, as I claim, and that it is historical and in a specific material and embodied context. And so that's not to say that different kinds of bookishness didn't exist before. It certainly did. There's been book fetishism and book kitsch for a long time, thank goodness. But I do think that there is something distinct about the contemporary period that I was trying to trace out. So I'm kind of hoping it'd be wonderful to see other people pursue other forms of bookishness or codexness, or however we want to call it. I hope that it gives a new kind of perspective and paradigm for thinking about these marvelous objects as books, to see them differently, as you described.
Okay, well, I feel like that leads directly and of course, chronologically into Lear's question. So Lear, you want to take it from there?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking the same thing. First of all, thanks, Jessica, for coming here and doing this presentation. It's amazing. I was thinking of this recent Facebook post that I saw that was talking about romanticizing video games as opposed to books, and how, on a rainy day, we might be daydreaming about cozying up under a warm blanket and just reading whatever book we like the most. But we don't see that same idealization of video games of like, it's rainy, so I'm just going to play Stardew Valley, for instance, or Minecraft or something. And I was wondering, because I'm also thinking of, when you talk about iPhone covers modeled after books, how we see the same process with, say, Game Boys, for instance. And I was wondering if bookishness could also starting to spread to other media, and like to gaming, retro gaming specifically, I guess, and more to kind of spread like this. And I think Caleb also had a way of drifting on my question that was pretty interesting. But
that's great. I love I think the word I take from your question is nostalgia, right? The kind of that what connects all of those things is a nostalgia. And I think one of the reasons why Game Boys, or the kind of handheld means of playing a game versus the screen, it has to do with, again, the body and our ability to hold it and encompass it, to curl up with a book, which had really negative connotations in the 19th century of masturbation for girls, especially. The novel is dangerous and scary and provocative, but also very physical and sensual. And so I wonder if maybe it's a question of nostalgia, and that goes to that kind of post-digital concept that we are now so into the digital that the elements from the early days of digital now seem like a previous time, and so are sources of desire and nostalgia for us. And so that does absolutely fit into what I'm talking about, this kind of desire, aesthetic, and then the inspiration to make things with those feelings, or from those feelings. Does that help? I don't know if I addressed that question very well.
Definitely, thank you.
But nostalgia is a word that, like kitsch, that kind of circles around this project, that I frankly, don't have mastery over. It's one of those very slippery words and concepts. And now certainly, like in post, thank God, post the Trump era is also a word of suggestive politics and peril. So it is something that we need to take very seriously, and not just say, oh, nostalgia and kitsch as lowbrow popular culture, media, and aesthetics. Clearly, we are in an age where the nostalgic is very powerful and provocative, and perhaps even terrifying, and something we certainly need to think seriously about.
Wow, great.
Sorry.
We've got a slightly different direction come from Shama, who's over there in India, wants to ask a question. Slightly different direction.
Yeah, so should I say my question?
Go ahead, Shama. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So what I wanted to ask you is more of a comment that I would like to hear from you. Is that when I was doing my undergraduation here, I used to see my friends, actually my classmates, they used to move about in spite of having a very capable bag. They used to have their books in their hands,
Yeah.
like William Shakespeare written on it, and they used to travel by the metro or go by the streets holding that book. And being from a space which has had like a 250 years history of colonialism, um, this social marker is very important. And we
Yeah.
also had our professors in class talk about how the whole glamour of English literature also comes into play. So I was just wondering how you interpret this idea of these authors as a commodity, because nowadays we see that in the book covers, the names of the authors are much more bigger than the actual name of the book. So what do you think about this? That's all. That was my question.
No, that's great. Actually, there was an article in the New York Times that, in addition to Stephen Hall's The Rorschach text, inspired my thinking. And the title was, "If it's a Kindle, how do you know it's Proust?"
Yeah, I actually have it opened in the tab. So yeah, thank you for that.
Because that article it touches on your points, which was, if you're on the subway, sometimes we don't just read for ourselves. Sometimes we read so that we can be read by other people. Like your bookshelves, yeah, they hold your content, but they also speak the kind of self-presentation that you want to present. And so this article is very much about like, well, I want people to know I'm reading Proust on the subway. And by the way, like the e-readers took off, the Kindle took off with Harlequin romances, with the novels nobody wants people to know that they're reading, right? Like, so you're absolutely right, that this aspect of literature and reading, which is, self-presentation and production, and also judging others, is bound up. And those are kind of the politics, which also get to your other point, right? About the book as an author, and especially British to India, right? The book is also an instrument of colonialization, of power, and so is literature and the canon. It's not just all pleasure and good stories. It's politics and power, and the imposition of power and of values, and of Proust over Harlequin. So I think your question is really at the heart of my book project, and there's so much in there that I didn't get to explore. Maybe you will. It's a good question.
Excellent. I keep thinking about, I was thinking I would never judge somebody for reading that, but I remember the first time I was at a school recital in my kid's elementary school, and saw a mom who was just totally absorbed by 50 Shades of Grey, the physical copy, and thinking I don't have that kind of courage. But in any case, next up, we have
I judge people by their bookshelves, Mark. As you know,
indeed,
Mark is the much kinder of the friendship, but it's a really true thing, right? Like truly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, show me their bookshelves, and I'll know something about them at least.
Yeah.
Hey, Danny Snelson from across town has so many questions, but we'll let him pick his favorite one.
Oh, thanks. Hi, this is so lovely. And it was so great to read through the book. I had two questions that I think maybe are a little bit related, that are about the design of the book itself. I was really interested in how you chose the shoe on the cover. And you have so many examples of kitschy bookishness. But I was reading it on an ebook as well, and the images, like they're so beautifully designed for digital representation. Like they float on the page and they have that kind of like fake apple shadow. And so it seems like there's something interesting about maybe the design of the book was geared toward its digital edition, which I think is a really interesting design choice, maybe for this book in particular. So I wanted to know if that was the case at all. And the other question I had, which may or may not be related, is about the paper email at the end, which is such a great. I was trying to figure out what you call that. Is it like a reverse skeuomorph or something, like going in the other direction? But so I've been really interested in like the library of the printed web, or the post-digital publishing archive, and these like various print-on-demand initiatives where you try and take the internet and print it out, and that doesn't really show up. And so I was wondering if you've been thinking more about like printing the internet since you've finished the project.
Yeah, those are great. Those are super great questions. I wish I could say more about the cover and the actual design of the book. I had nothing to do with it. And I was actually disappointed with the cover of the book. because I mean, I like the shoe and everything, but I really wanted cake or cupcakes, like something sweet. And whenever I would give talks about the book, some of you remember, like I would always show these like great cupcakes it's actually from a bakery in India. These cupcakes that have book titles on them. And so I wanted something like that. And then when they sent me the shoe, I was like, I don't wear Converse. Can it be a stiletto? And they said no. So I had nothing to do with that. But I'm glad it shows up on the Kindle. Wow, that's great. The paper email is another one of those things. I mean, reflecting on your questions are also interesting because you're pointing out the things in the book that were the most important moments of my thinking. I write about it in the coda that the paper email was like, I was walking down the street and saw it. It was before I started this project, when I was still in LA. And it was just that thing that, yeah, a skeuomorph from, being a student of Kate Hale's, I was like, that's a skeuomorph and it means something. And I don't know what it means, but I know it means something, I'll think about it for another 10 years. And so that was definitely a thing that really, really mattered and was a catalyst. But it took me a long time to figure out why and how. And I think your point of reverse skeuomorph is so interesting because we tend to write the history of media as linear and progressive, but of course it's not. And those kinds of moments of recursion are really what interests me. So bookishness to me is one of those moments where we seem to be talking about progress and moving to the digital, and then really, clearly books were still around, but there is this moment of a renewed sense of loving books, of needing books, of making books anew for this moment. And I'm interested in those moments where it messes with the teleological structure and all the expectations. Print on demand, I haven't explored. Really, for me, bookishness was about those things that couldn't be digitized. So the Rorschach texts for John, like a book that does not translate to the Kindle, or House of Leaves, or any of those like big bulky things that are hard to carry along. So, a lot's changed since I started writing the book about the ability to print on demand, certainly, but I was really interested in thinking about books and literature, not born digital literature necessarily, that refuse digitization.
All right, well, this makes me think of two things we got to talk about after this conversation, which are Aaron Reed's Subcutanean, a print-on-demand novel that varies depending on which copy you get, randomly changed, and the fact that Icebound Compendium, neither Icebound Compendium, I think, or Between Page and Screen can work anymore. Again, thinking about like shelf life, right? But don't worry about my questions or my points. It's time for Liz Lush, one of our great collaborators, mentors, best friends. Here's Liz has a question about pedagogy.
Sure. Yeah, I miss you guys so much. So it's really great to see the way that you position your daughter as a kind of model reader.
Yeah.
But I was curious if you could say more about, pedagogical modes of transmitting bookishness to kind of the next generation. And, in particular, when I teach electronic literature, I always start in the rare books room and do a session on, kind of art books and concrete poetry and all these sorts of experiments with the page and with binding in order to get students to think creatively about working with the screen. Now that, our rare books rooms are closed, do you have kind of suggestions for ways to have that kind of encounter? I know that this book is mostly about everyday books.
Yeah.
But I just was, reaching around for ideas because I had that feeling of loss this semester.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say something snarky about, don't ask me any questions about pedagogy these days because I'm doing a very bad job. But no, I think I actually hope that the bookishness lens, I think that our students get bookishness. Like they have the stuff. They are using the backgrounds. Where's Adrian? Cute Adrian. They are using the backgrounds. They see it and understand it. And sometimes they feel bad about it or guilty about it. Like they've been taught that, I've always had this feeling that my students have been taught that digital is bad, that literature that they read on the computer doesn't count as real literature, that texting and blogging doesn't count as real writing, et cetera. And so I've always seen it as my job to change those perspectives. And I think that bookishness can helpfully bridge that and then bring them back to thinking about books as things that are beautiful, things that are constructed, things that have wonder, things that have history, and thus things that you would actually want to research in and of themselves, so that it's not just seeking out the first edition of Jane Austen, but actually being interested in, the kinds of, what kind of paper, what kind of binding, why was it published anonymously in the first, in its first edition, those kinds of questions. So perhaps there's a kind of hook there with the bookishness concept.
Great.
I'm going to go kind of out of order, but just to make sure we get questions from everybody. Sarah Siston, one of our monthly ELIT reading group regulars, has a question for you. Sarah, you want to pose that question?
Sure. I'm not sure about this question yet, but so we've been talking a lot about bookishness showing up in things that aren't digital or books, like showing up in what I've kind of been thinking of as merch, like my tote bag has The Great Gatsby on it or whatever. Yeah. And I'm wondering about bookishness showing up in digital spaces, and if you have anything to say about that, like specifically the first thing I did on the Kindle was turn off the skeuomorphic like page turn, because it was driving me nuts, and just this trying to make the digital behave like print instead of trying to make it do things that it specifically uniquely could do. And so that tension between, I guess, trying to make it skeuomorphic versus have its unique qualities. But at the same time, I'm working on a project that's looking at 90s zines and what sorts of like unique politics and aesthetics I might be able to bring from zine archives into designing a different kind of digital space. So I'm wondering if you have anything to say about just sort of what kinds of bookishness you see specifically in the digital realm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what was really exciting to me, because I was initially focused on experimental novels, print novels. And then, I mean, I started to see it in digital literature, even in Mark's work, especially in Mark's work, in the Marginalia in the Library of Babel, which I don't actually know if I wrote about in this book or somewhere else, but is one of my favorite pieces, with the Post-it notes on the web, which is just so incongruous, like it's so brilliant. And then, J.R. Carpenter, all of her work has that kind of notebook aesthetic, paper aesthetic. Jason Nelson. I have slides, tons of slides, because I've given this versions of this talk at ELO conferences. Travis Alber, Caitlin Fisher, for sure. There's tons of, and a lot of female writers, digital writers, a lot of female writers of electronic literature that play with the nostalgia, and especially play with the paper arts, the marginal. I think it was Caleb who had brought up Sienna, is that right? Or maybe it was Danny. The marginal aesthetics of craft, not art, that a lot of these female ELIT writers are recuperating and in a digital space. I'm really fascinated by that. I think it's really interesting, because of course the digital doesn't need to be about paper or books at all, but of course we have web pages, and e-readers, as Joanna Drucker has taught us, are formatted as pages and books, which they don't need to be, right? It's a failure of imagination on the designer's part and on readers' parts that we've just, transported from one medium to another. So I actually think like it's the book and bookishness is everywhere in digital culture. It's kind of the default actually of digital culture. And I bring that up also in terms of thinking about fake books, and thinking about going even back to Alan Turing and the computer as imitation machine, and thinking about fakeness and imitation is actually central to computers and to computer use. And the medium of choice for fakery in the digital is the book or the page or the web page. So I really do think it's everywhere. So I'm really interested. I'm glad you're interested in zines, because that's the kind of radical feminist way of bringing that default to an actual aesthetic and to be visible.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
Do you think it transcends just the focus on the materiality and the sort of nostalgia of it into something that has a politics and an ethics too, specifically like the feminist and the craft aspects?
Yeah, I do. And I also think, nostalgia can have a politics and an ethics too. And kitsch does too. Not just one, a lot of theorists of kitsch read kitsch as fascist, right? But that's not how Daniel Tiffany traces it back. So, I mean, when he traces it back to 18th century poetics, it's more colloquial, it's more, and it's more playful, and it's more colloquial, it's more democratic than actually totalitarian. So, but yeah, I absolutely do. I think aesthetics, and especially the values of aesthetics, are always bound up in certain kind of cultural values, and thus politics.
Thank you.
All
Yeah,
right, well,
I'll be eager to see that piece. That sounds cool.
Well, I hate to be that guy, especially since I get the benefit of conversations with Jessica very frequently, but we have reached the end of our hour, and I'm conscious of everybody's time, and of course of Zoom fatigue. So the first thing I want to do is have us let's give some nice Zoom applause, some snaps to Jessica, some in gratitude for her time. I really do appreciate that. I feel like to wrap things up, I was thinking during Jessica's talk, boy, I really don't have enough bookish things in my life. And then I thought, wait a second, I do. So I'm going to put on my COVID mask.
Does it have books?
Don't panic, which is the slogan of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh,
one of my favorite bookish books about books in the digital age, pre-digital age, I guess, some ways. But I'm also going to take it off, because then you won't be able to hear me. But in any case, listen, thank you all for joining us. Wonderful discussion in the chat that I'm going to download. All of this will be archived. I'll be taking this video, putting it up on YouTube if you want to share it with your students or with colleagues, or think about it later. Again, I just need to remind you, February 26th, we got another talk coming up about scholarly writing groups. We've got March 19th, No Award for Win. April 7th, I believe it is, Jeremy Douglas. And if you follow my Twitter, you'll hear about endless events. Don't forget, by February 28th, you can submit your works or nominate someone for one of the 3 ELO awards, each of which comes with a $1,000 prize. And Jessica, thank you. This was a wonderful, wonderful book launch. And I cannot wait till we as a group can be with you in person and toast your success, toast this contribution you've given all of us who love books so deeply and love the bookish culture that they come with.
And please feel free, I didn't get to read all of the questions or answer all the questions, but you can absolutely email me, and I'm happy to continue conversations or send the links to things. I saw that. So please don't hesitate. And thank you all so much. It was so lovely to hear your questions. I'm so grateful. I hope you all take good care and are well. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording and